Good morning, church. I'm always excited when I get to talk to the big people and prepare a meaningful lesson, I hope, from what is sometimes and is today a difficult text from Matthew 15. Today's word is leftovers. Do you like leftovers? Some people do and some people don't. I like leftovers because I don't like to waste food. And if you ask my wife, I don't like to waste anything because unlike what she says, I'm cheap, I'm actually frugal. But just like you, I have my favorite foods. Even though I can eat pizza for breakfast and an omelet at night, I do have my favorite foods. But I can eat leftovers. Now, what do you do with leftovers? Leftovers can be a real problem. They are a problem because we have so much waste in the United States. According to one report, we waste 25% of all the food and drink that we purchase. And this is because we let it spoil, we throw it away, we don't use our leftovers. Because of this, and in spite of this, 1 out of 6 Americans are hungry. 800 million people in the world are hungry every day. There seems to be an abundance of food in our culture, but some people don't have enough. And how do we fix this problem? I'm not sure if we can answer that today, but that was also a problem in the days of Jesus. Now, today in Matthew 15, we have some amazing stories that we're going to be talking about, and we have stories about leftovers. We have stories about what's clean and what's unclean, what a person can eat and what they can't eat, and who is worthy of God's grace, acceptance, and salvation. What are the boundaries of God's love? In verses 1 through 9, as we begin chapter 15, we have a disagreement between the religious leaders of that day and Jesus over about what was clean and unclean. And listen to these verses. The religious scholars came to Jesus criticizing him and his disciples, and they'd ask, "Why do your disciples play fast and loose with the rules? Why do they not wash their hands before eating?" Well, Jesus put it right back to them. He said, "Why do you use your rules to play fast and loose with God's commandments? You say everything I have belongs to God. And because of that, you say when your father or mother needs something, and the Bible says, respect your father and mother, I don't have anything for you because I've given everything to God." Isaiah's prophecy of you hits the bullseye. When Isaiah says, these people make a big show of saying the right thing, but their heart isn't in it. They act like they're worshiping me, but they don't mean it. They use me as a cover for teaching whatever suits their fancy. Now, in these verses, we have a head-on collision between Jesus and the religious leaders of the day over how to wash your hands. Now, this seems like a silly thing to talk about. And we're not even talking about eating with dirty hands. Jesus didn't eat with dirty hands. We know that when we've been house cleaning, doing yard work, when we come in to eat, we wash our hands. If you've been mowing the grass or working on the car, you wash your hands before you eat. You've been outside for football or soccer practice or been playing outside, you wash your hands before you eat. Jesus did that. We're not talking about dirty hands. We're talking about a ritual. We're talking about a ceremony. Even if Jesus had washed his hands, he was expected to do the second washing of hands. That was a ceremony to prove that he was spiritually clean. It was not enough just to wash your hands. That was about cleanliness. The religious leaders were talking about a ceremony of washing your hands to make you spiritually accepted to your people and to God. And this ceremonial washing was a part of the oral law, not the written law. And here's how it works. There was a pitcher of water, and it was blessed. The water in it was blessed. And then you pour the water over your fingers, for it would drip off your wrist, and you wash your hands by putting your fingers into the palm of the hand. Then you turn your hands this way, and the water is poured so that the water drips off your fingers. Then your hands are ceremonially clean. You're pure. Now, Jesus didn't do this second washing. And the leaders came to him and said, "Why do you and your disciples break the rules about washing your hands?" Jesus came right back and he said, "You break the rules all the time, but not even take care of your father and mother by using the rule of, I've given everything I own to God, so I don't have anything for you." That's why Isaiah said, you teach your rules for the commandments of God. You act like you're worshiping me, but your hearts are not in it. So here's the clash, here's the collision, here's the contest between two kinds of religion. To the religious leaders of that day, religion was keeping certain rules, like the right way to wash your hands. To Jesus, religion was something that came from your heart. Religion comes from love and kindness that's above and beyond the law. In verses 10 through 20, we have a showdown between the religious leaders and Jesus about what is good and what is evil. Listen to these verses, verses 10 through 20. He then called the crowd together and said, listen and take this to heart. It's not what you eat, it's not what you swallow that pollutes your life. Peter said, I don't get it. What are you talking about? And Jesus said, don't you know that anything that is swallowed just passes through your body? It's a temporary thing. But what comes out of your mouth gets its start in your heart and your mind. That's what pollutes. Eating or drinking certain foods, washing or not washing your hands, that's neither here nor there. Now, this may be the most shocking thing Jesus ever said to the people of his day. It may not be shocking to us, but Jesus not only condemns ritual and ceremonial religion, he cancels out a lot of the book of Leviticus about the food laws of the Old Testament. And because he did that, when we leave today, we can go eat pork, shrimp, and catfish. And they couldn't. Once for all, Jesus lays down that what matters is not the state of our rule keeping, but the state of our hearts. And the religious leaders were shocked. This was revolutionary. Jesus said, if you think you're pleasing God by the way you wash your hands, you're wrong. And if you follow your leaders that tell you that it's about washing your hands that makes you right or wrong, clean or unclean, you're all wrong. Listen to Jesus. The truth is religion is just about keeping rules. It's probably easy. It's easier than loving your neighbors yourself and helping people in need. That's harder than just keeping rules. Well, again, Peter said, after Jesus taught this, Peter said, I just don't understand. How are you saying this? Why are you saying this? And Jesus said very plainly, and look this up in different versions of the New Testament. Jesus said, don't you know that whatever you eat ends up in the toilet? But what comes out of your mouth comes from your heart and your mind, and it shows you what you really are. It's from the heart that evil and hate and murder and fornication and lies and thefts come from. Eating or not eating certain foods or not washing your hands in a prescribed manner, that does not matter. What matters to God is not how we act, but why we act. It's not so much what we do, but what we wish in our hearts to do. In verses 22 through 28, we have the answer to the question, what are the limits? What are the boundaries of God's grace? Who will God love and accept and save? Who is clean and who is unclean? We understand the limits of God's grace as it applies to godly and ungodly, righteous and unrighteous people, but there's always been limits to God's grace. In the Old Testament times, Abraham and his descendants, by bloodlines and specific ways of living, rule keeping, those were the boundaries. At the same time, when we read Matthew 15, we read some of the prophecy of the Old Testament, we read through the Psalms, it's clear that God is interested in more than just one race of people. God is interested in the whole creation and all people. God is interested in, rules over, and reaches out to all of creation. And Jesus, in his teachings, particularly here in Matthew 15 and in the book of Acts, we read about the hard struggle to expand the boundaries of God's kingdom to all people. In this story, in Matthew 15, we have object lessons about the limits of God's grace. Verses 22 through 28. Jesus took a trip to Tyre and Sidon, and they had hardly arrived when a Canaanite woman came down from the hills and pleaded, "Mercy, Master, Son of David, My daughter is sick, and I need help. Jesus ignored her. The disciples came to Jesus and said, she's bothering us. Would you please take care of her? She's driving us crazy. And Jesus refused, telling them, I've got my hands full dealing with my people, the lost sheep of Israel, and not other people. The woman came back to Jesus, dropped her knees, and begged, Master, help me. And Jesus said, it's not right to take the bread out of the children's mouths and throw it to the dogs. Jesus was saying it's not right to take the bread that's intended for my people, the Jews, and give it to non-Jewish people. She was quick. She said, Master, even the beggar dogs get scraps from the Master's table. And the message said, Jesus gave in and said, oh woman, your faith is something else. What you want is what you get. And her daughter was healed immediately. Now there's great implications in this story. First of all, Jesus is traveling outside of Jewish territory. And Jews didn't ordinarily do this. And Jesus didn't ordinarily do this. This is a foreshadowing of the gospel going to the whole world. This is the beginning of the end of all barriers between humans and God, between all humans and God. This was also near the end of the earthly ministry of Jesus. And it was very important that he prepared his disciples not only for his death, but to continue his ministry to the world and to the whole world. Jesus wanted and needed time to prepare himself and his followers for what was to come. Now, there were things he needed to tell them, things he needed to explain, things they needed to understand, and what he wanted them to do. And this day was one of those things. But there were always human needs. Just like in our life, there's always human needs that delay or interfere with our plans sometimes. The same with Jesus. We meet a woman whose daughter was sick. She evidently had heard the stories about Jesus and the great things he could do. She followed Jesus and his disciples crying for help. And Jesus appears not to hear her or to at least ignore her. And the disciples were just embarrassed. They said, she's driving us crazy. Do something with this woman. There was a problem. Jesus must have been touched by this woman, her desperate plea for help. But she was a woman, she was a Gentile, and she was a Canaanite. And the Canaanites were historic enemies of Israel. And Jesus, until this time, had limited his ministry to his own people, the Jews. So what will Jesus do? What can he do? He decides, I think, to create faith in the heart of this Canaanite woman. Jesus said it's not right, it's not fair to take the children's bread, the Jews, and throw it to the dogs, the Gentiles. Now, we only have what's written in our Bible. We can't see the face of Jesus. We can't see his expression. We can't hear the tone of his voice. The language seems mean and cold, but was Jesus teasing her? Was Jesus testing her? Was this in the form of questions? Should I share the bread with the dogs? It was common slang for the Jews at that time to refer to non-Jews as dogs. Dogs at that time were, for the most part, loose and wild. They were scavengers. They were always knocking over the garbage cans and spilling the garbage. Maybe Jesus said this was a smile and compassion on his face. It's like if I tell Dale, you rascal, you. Well, I'm not calling him a low-down, chicken-thieving rascal. It's a term of endearment. You old rascal, you. The word Jesus used for dog was not the word used for a wild, vicious scavenger dog. It was a dog used for a household pet. It was a completely different word. The woman called on quickly and she said, that's true. But even the dogs eat the leftovers from the master's table. Jesus was happy with her faith and her spirit, and he healed her daughter immediately. So why did Jesus heal her daughter? Well, first of all, he saw she had great love for her daughter. And she had a problem. She needed help. She had faith that grew as she talked to Jesus. She started out by calling Jesus the son of David. And in the conversation, he came to call him Jesus, Master, Lord. And she was persistent and wouldn't take no for an answer. Well, at the conclusion of Matthew 15, we have another object lesson. Listen to these verses 29 through 39. Jesus returned to his country and was walking along the lake of Galilee. He climbed a mountain and took his place, ready to receive the crowds. And they came, tons of them. All sorts of people in need, and more or less threw them down at the feet of Jesus to see what he would do. He healed them. And when the people saw, they were astonished. They let everyone know that God was blazingly alive among them. But Jesus wasn't finished. He called his disciples and said, "These people have been with us for 3 days. They don't have anything to eat. I can't send them away without a meal. They won't make it home." And the disciples said, "Where are we going to find food in this place?" And Jesus said, "What do you have?" They said, "We have 7 loaves of bread and a few fish." So Jesus directed the people to sit down. He took the 7 loaves of fish, blessed it, they distributed it. Everybody ate all they wanted, and they took up 7 baskets of leftovers. The word of the day. So on this same journey, when Jesus is teaching and preparing his disciples for what was to come and to continue his mission, we see a continuation of the story of boundaries being crossed. Jesus is curing the sick. We see his concern for the tired and the hungry. We see his power and compassion. And we read that these people glorified the God of Israel. Evidently, many, if not all, these people were Gentiles. So we have valuable lessons today from leftovers. Leftovers are valuable. We don't need to waste leftovers. There are hungry people in the world. But we don't need to waste precious resources. The gospel of Christ, that's for everyone. God doesn't see anyone as a leftover. God doesn't see anyone as unclean. Anyone over the boundaries of his grace and love. Jesus lived and died for everyone. The concern and love and power of Jesus is available for everyone. The grace of God is for everyone. The living bread of Jesus is for everyone. You and me, we all, in God's eyes, are not leftovers. We are grade A, premium, choice, prime in the eyes of God. Thanks be to God. Amen.